Signed, say you were here and witnessed this great talk.
Yeah, I didn't take your notes. I don't have any.
Okay.
I just have my phone because I'm on call. I'll move it out of the way so you don't hit it.
I'm gonna get this score on this.
Okay. Just the beginning.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to this talk. So we have Marilyn Ballantyne, the Chief Nurse Executive and Clinician Investigator, and Amir, who everyone knows as well, Family Centred Care Specialist. I think this is going to be a very cool partnership between the two to really tell some stories and match with the research around transitioning to rehab. We often talk about transitioning from rehab settings. So I'd like to welcome you both and invite Marilyn to the podium. Enjoy.
Thank you, Amy. So as Amy said, Amir and I are going to shine a light on what families want you to know about their experiences prior to rehab, on their first early experiences. And our agenda today are really giving you a little bit of a story first, then some discussion around some videos that we're going to show you from a recent parent panel that we held here. And then I'll weave in 5 parts of our program of research around early transitions. So with no further ado, we're going to take you on this idea of a first flight, families' first stories, starting from the time of birth forward, and the impact that their stories and the research we're going to tell you about has on our care, our research, and our education here at Holland Bloorview. So we'll start first by giving you the context. Oh, I'm not going to be able to do this. So there we go. Back. There. Yeah, we have to get down. It's a bit of a, do you have a fine motor issue? Yes, I do. For all the OTs in the room.
Different transitions. The first one was off the ICU. I think that was the biggest one because I left an ICU really feeling prepared to take Gabriel home. He was still on home oxygen, so I knew how to recognize his needs in case he was into respiratory distress. So I was prepared for that, and I was prepared to deliver every piece of information to every specialist we saw leaving the ICU. We saw eye clinic, chest clinic, and all the clinics that see kids, and there were so many appointments. And but I was prepared for those appointments. I knew what to ask because it was off the ICU. And but what I was lacking was to have everybody was seeing pieces of Gabriel, this piece, that piece, that piece. Nobody saw him as a whole child, and that was really hard for me. And also nobody asked how we were doing as a family. We had just been through a very traumatic experience. We lost a twin, and nobody asked how we were doing. It was all about Gabriel's body parts. And that was very difficult for us to understand how to put everything together. On top of that, I noticed that Gabriel's development was very delayed. I knew the red flags. I had a lot of education class on development, so I was very proactive from the beginning when you left an ICU to do early intervention, OT, PT, and all the T's that Brenda said. We had it all in place. But I was still looking for something else, and then we were referred to another doctor, and I came to that appointment with so much hope that I was going to have another light. What else could I do to help Gabriel? And that appointment, I was very disappointed because the doctor said to me, there's nothing I can do right now. Got the diagnosis of CP. Wasn't actually, I don't see it as a transition, it was an add-on, everything else that I was already doing.
I'm going to stop it right there. We're actually going to go back to back a couple of slides because we're going to show that video one more time for a little discussion. And this is sort of the beginning of the panel, just setting the context around what the families were sharing with us about their lives.
My name is Brenda Hanyu, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my family in no particular order. A little bit, I guess, about how I got here. So I am the mom to 2 boys. I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old. My 9-year-old McLean has cerebral palsy. He is a surviving twin. His identical brother, Braden, passed away in utero at 29 weeks from a condition known as twin-to-twin transfusion. At the time, my older son was 19 months old, and same as Cheryl, second pregnancy was going fantastic after I got over the shock of expecting identical twin boys, thinking how the heck am I going to deal with 3 boys under the age of 2 years old. In any event, McLean, like I said, was born at 29 and 5, and he was emergency C-section to save his life after his brother had passed away. He was then transferred to another hospital. I gave birth at our local community hospital, and he was transferred to another hospital that had a level 3 nursery, where he spent over 3 months there, which we thought was going to be a fairly normal course for him. We had no indication that it would be off course too much, except for the fact that he was a preemie, except that he developed a condition known as kernicterus from untreated jaundice. And unfortunately, that left him with a GMFCS level 4 cerebral palsy, as well as deaf as well.
We went through infertility, and then I got pregnant with my first son, Thomas, and then we attempted a second pregnancy. We had to go through in vitro again, and for our surprise, we were expecting twins, just like you. So how am I going to handle 3 boys under the age of 3? But halfway through that pregnancy, we found out that one of the twins had a heart condition, and he was not going to make it to birth, and he passed away at 25 weeks. And 26 weeks, I went into premature labor, and I had an emergency C-section. And Michael was a stillborn, and Gabe was rushed into the ICU at Mount Sinai Hospital, which became our home for 146 days. So needless to say, that journey was a very scary one. It was diving to the unknown. I think Cheryl explained really well. But I think we were very fortunate to be part of a pilot study at Mount Sinai called Family Integrated Care, which brought us to the bedside, Cheryl. I spent 12 hours by Gabriel's bedside. I had over 500 hours of skin to skin, even when he was ventilated. That was very empowering for me. We had education sessions every day. So I learned a lot about prematurity. I learned a lot about Gabriel's condition in ICU. And I actually had to deliver at rounds. And first, I was terrified to have all that team near me, but that was so important for me going home.
So that gives you a context of where these families started, their beginning story, and it's those stories actually that motivated me to move towards a program of research that was really helping parents of these fragile infants who started their lives in acute care hospitals, who transitioned home, who received a diagnosis, and then they join Holland Bloor Review. So a quick overview of 5 stages of research that we'll talk about today in the second half of the presentation, which is the scoping review, parent interviews that match with these stories, a provincial scan that we've done. This video is coming from the Symposium that we hosted about 6 weeks ago, and moving forward then into some intervention. So with no further ado, we'll continue on the flight or on the journey with these families, guided by Amir, of some of the key insights that we wanted to share from the parent panel that really help us understand transition to Holland Bloor Review in a really deep way and a touching way. I learned a lot, and this is a business that I've been in for a long time. So Amir, I'll hand back over to you to talk about the transition process of coming through all these services.
Excellent. Thanks, Marilyn. So I get the pleasure of sort of showing you some of the videos and some of what the panel had to say about 3 different topics. And the first one is around transition process and experience. So as I play the video, it's about 7.5 minutes. Let's look for some of the key messages that we're hearing in that. Let's also pay attention to my hair, because I was having the worst hair day of my life. But really, let's pay attention to what some of the key messages are there that we're hearing from families. And then we'll have a little discussion after.
So I see our story like in 2 different transitions. The first one was off the ICU. I think that was the biggest one. Because I left an ICU really feeling prepared to take Gabriel home. He was still on home oxygen, so I knew how to recognize his needs in case he was into respiratory distress, So I was prepared for that, and I was prepared to deliver every piece of information to every specialist we saw leaving the ICU. We saw eye clinic, chest clinic, and all the clinics that see kids, and there were so many appointments. And but I was prepared for those appointments. I knew what to ask because it was often ICU. And but what I was lacking was to have, everybody was seeing pieces of Gabriel. This piece, that piece, that piece. Nobody saw him as a whole child. And that was really hard for me. And also nobody asked how we were doing as a family. We had just been through a very traumatic experience. We lost a twin. And nobody asked how we were doing. It was all about Gabriel's body parts. And that was very difficult for us to understand how to put everything together. On top of that, I noticed that Gabriel's development was very delayed. I was able to, I knew the red flags. I had lots of education class on development, so I was very proactive from the beginning when you left an ICU to do early intervention, OTPT, and all the T's that Brenda said. We had it all in place. But I was still looking for something else, and then we were referred to another doctor, and I came to that appointment with so much hope that I was going to have another light. What else could I do to help Gabriel? And that appointment, I was very disappointed because the doctor said to me, there's nothing I can do right now. Got the diagnosis of CP. It wasn't actually, I don't say it's a transition, it was an add-on, everything else that I was already doing. And I felt there was some lack of empathy for everything that, what was happening to us at that time. Because we had just received life-altering news. I was expecting somebody to feel more empathetic for what we were going through because it was a new world for us. It was the beginning of that journey that we didn't know anything about it. But I went, right after the diagnosis, I went to a therapist and she said to me, he's the same boy he was yesterday. He just had a new label. And that same therapist connected me with this amazing woman here on my left that I didn't know she was going to be on the panel with me. And she accepted to go on a blind date with me. And I picked her brain. For 2 hours, I asked her so many questions from logistics to how she coped as a family and how she kept her family together after so many years down the road from me. And that was incredible. The peer-to-peer support is so very important. And I wish I had the connection so much earlier so I knew I wasn't alone. Because I thought I was the only mom living in an ICU with a diagnosis of CP because I had not met any other family with a child with disability after the ICU. Because I was so involved in Gabriel's care and I was so in this mode of giving him the best opportunities and the best possibilities that I had in 2015, 187 appointments.
I'd like to explain the first 2 years as the Bermuda Triangle, because you kind of get trapped and you're in this world and you don't know how to get out of it and you don't know how to manage it and nobody seems to be able to reach you in there because you're just in a vortex.
Sorry, I'm going to stop that video there. Some technical challenges. I'm not technically savvy, so. In that first video, when we hear Fabiana talking, what are some of the things that she's telling us that are really important for us to keep in mind when we think about transitions and the process of the transition? All right.
I guess the empathy of where they've come from and what has made them and kind of the strength that they have come into this, but then there's a bigger history that's come before meeting music women.
Right. It's a great point. And especially in the beginning of the journey, empathy is so important. So important. Sorry?
You have to repeat.
I have to repeat the question. Okay, thank you. Sorry. The answer. So the answer really is the empathy piece, and the first part of the journey is really important for our families. That empathy, because they're still struggling, and you'll hear in the next story about what that struggle looks like. What else do we hear in that video? Kim?
I think about the transition not for the child but for the entire family, especially when the mom talks about how to keep her family together,
Right.
so it's the child within that family.
Right, so we're talking a lot about, and I'm just going to repeat for the
Yeah.
purpose of this, is the transition for the whole family and the importance of seeing that child and everything that surrounds that child as we're transitioning and providing those supports for that. I saw, was it Natasha, did you have your hand? Or was it, no, it was there, sorry.
Me, just that the child is a whole, not fragmented, not arms, not just legs, but a whole person, whole being that is part of the family.
Yeah, she talks about how everyone saw saw Gabriel as an individual, or individual pieces of Gabriel, and never really looked at him as a child, and how important it is for somebody to look at him as a whole child. Anybody else want to share?
As you mentioned how peer support was really helpful.
Peer
and
support.
would have liked it earlier on. And I think that's really important that these families do get connected, even when they're here.
Yeah.
That we connect them with their families.
And she really talks a lot about that, the importance of that peer support, and early on, right? And the feeling of loneliness around that first time, she thinks that she was the only one going through it until she met somebody. And what I really liked about it was the clinician had said to her, Gabriel's the same boy as he was yesterday. And he's just got a label now. And so for me, that really brings out the power of the words we use. How just a few sentences or a few words put together in such a nice way can make such a difference and take our clients and families in a whole different direction in terms of hope. And then that same clinician took the time to make sure that right away they connected that person with the peer support that she knew was important. So it's also about the accountability and thinking about what this family needs and moving them forward. The other piece that really stuck out for me was, and this is something that I felt, and I shared when I share my story a lot, is about nobody asked how we were doing. And that doesn't happen often in the transition process, especially at the beginning. And we hear a lot about, she talks about it's a new world, and there's a lack of empathy, and nobody actually asked me how I was doing in this new world. And that really resonates with me as somebody who went through a similar journey. Nobody ever asked how emotionally distraught I was. So trying to pick up on some of that. I'll play this other video and then we'll have a little discussion around that. Same thing, we're looking for some key messages that we're hearing here. Bear with me while I try to figure this out. There it is.
And we came out of the NICU and I thought, oh, okay, we're okay. We come out of this unscathed. We're good. He's healthy, he's fine, and we had the same thing. His brain scans were great, everything was good. And it wasn't until we started to sort of get the hit after hit after hit that we started to realize, okay, something here is not okay. And I remember we brought him home the end of October, and right 3 days before Christmas, he was diagnosed with profound hearing loss. And and then he was diagnosed with CP. And then it always felt like it was one thing after the other thing after the other thing. And no one can prepare you for this. No one. Not a single person. Not even another parent can prepare you for this. This is a completely different world. You enter it, I believe, in a fight or flight mentality. It's going to consume every ounce of your being, and how you deal with that, I think, sort of defines the trajectory for the rest of the time in this journey. I had a ton of guilt. Obviously, my son passed away in utero. That had to be my fault, right? And then that led to McLean being put in the NICU, so that had to be my fault. And so it took a long time to get past that guilt personally, and then you deal with mental health issues, that whole piece going on. Meanwhile, I'm focused on, a 20-month-old and a newborn that has a lot of needs going on. And so the guilt was a really hard thing for me. I was alone. I had no one to talk to. No one understood what I was going through. I had no connection with other parents at that time. There just wasn't the peer-to-peer programs that there are now. It was a really, really hard time. And, I kind of felt like, what was my role here? And I'm going to blur these two lines of caregiver and parent, but what was I? Was I his mom? Was I his therapist? Was I his caregiver? Was I his nurse? Like, what was I? Because my first son, I was just his mom. I took him to mommy, baby play dates. We went to mommy, baby movies, and I was his mom, and that was it. And then all of a sudden, I have McLean, and now I'm his social worker. I'm his, service navigator. I am his everything else. And that's really tough because that wasn't my background. I was never going to be a stay-at-home mom. I had this, I was going to be in the business world. I was going to be this. I was going to be that. And so it's really difficult to sort of figure out what hat am I going to wear today. And I still struggle with that, but you learn to manage it as you go. I also had a lot of mistrust, obviously with what had happened to McLean, given the way that he acquired his brain injury. There was a lot of mistrust there. Who can I trust? Can I trust doctors and nurses and clinicians? Can I trust what they're telling me? You know, he goes and he's diagnosed with profound hearing loss, and they tell me, Mrs. Agnew, you're going to need to go and learn sign language because he's never going to benefit from a cochlear implant, and he's never going to be able to use hearing aids. Guess what? He's bilaterally implanted with cochlear implants. He reads at a grade 4 level. He speaks a little bit with difficulty, but the stories he tells are unbelievable. What if I had accepted that first diagnosis? What if I accepted that first clinician that told me, this is the end of this, go and sign him up for this? But I didn't. I said, no, I'm not okay with that. I need to get a second opinion, and then guess what? And you know, that's all the way along. He's never going to go to school, Mrs. Agnew. He's going to have to go to a special class. Really? He's fully integrated into grade 4 in a modified curriculum, learning the same thing that all of his peers are learning. He's never going to power a wheelchair, Mrs. Agnew. He can't utilize, you know, his hands or his head because he has the cochlear implants. How about his feet? His feet work great. Guess what? He powers a wheelchair with his feet now. And so, you know, you kind of think that you're really trying to work in partnership and collaboration with these therapists who you know care. I know people care. That's why you're in this business. But it becomes really hard as a parent when you feel like you're constantly like this, but it shouldn't be that way. It should be more collaborative.
A couple of things we're hearing in this one. What is she telling us? Jean? I knew you were going to go for that one, Jean. No doubt.
This piece that just jumps out to me is the whole caregiver. So she walked in as a parent, and then she realized, kind of in real time, I have a whole different set of expectations on me now, and challenges and stresses, and I'm also going to have those for the entire span of my child's life. And so it's coming to terms with your new role as a caregiver.
And that speaks to a lot of what we talked about. I'm going to repeat it just around for the sake of the mic. Is the answer was the whole role of the caregiver and how it's going to be a different looking role for the parent. But that speaks to how as healthcare providers and the health system in general, we've talked a lot about how we don't actually identify that person as a caregiver, and we don't assist them to say, hey, here's what your new role looks like, and you are a caregiver and you need to take care of yourself. And so those discussions are not happening, and that's the story that Brenda's telling us. A couple other things that we heard in this.
There's this overwhelming message that we as many healthcare providers underestimate the power of partnership with the family and that collaborative opportunity to work with family and support them through this process.
Right.
Like I think her last words were, they don't look at me as a collaborator, or they don't collaborate with me.
Yeah, they don't collaborate. So there's a whole line message around the importance of collaboration and what it means to a family. We heard a lot about the professional relationships and the importance of that relationship and the mistrust that can happen. But at the end of the day, even with the mistrust, she's saying that she still wants to collaborate. And she talks a lot about those professional relationships and what that really means to our clients and families. I heard a lot about focusing on the strengths. You know, we heard the stories around he's not going to do this, and he's not going to do this, he's not going to do that. And if she just listened to that diagnosis, she may have not taken her child to where he is now. And that speaks to the lived experience, right? That speaks to what the parents know best as well. And she talks about, well, how are his feet working? They're great. That's what he uses to power his wheelchair. So focusing on those strengths. And we heard a lot about the various roles that families have to play, and that speaks to the caregiver role. And sometimes, I've heard so many times parents tell me, I just want to be a parent. Don't want to be all the other roles. And so how can we support that? How can we educate them a little bit more? And also about the guilt that comes along. And I remember when I spoke with Brenda, Brenda talked a lot about her guilt and all these emotional feelings that she had. When she shows up at an appointment, you would never know that, right? Because she wants to show up and she wants to participate, and she doesn't want to show you those because that means so much. And so how do we then try to sort through some of that?
And I think that's something we have to be sensitive to. I think people show up at appointments like that when they're feeling it because they're scared, they let loose that caregiver because this grief is extremely overwhelming. And I think a lot of people don't really understand the grief that are feeling like the guilt.
Thank you. Yeah, and so the comment there is to be sensitive about the guilt that families are feeling and the emotions that are coming to the appointment, and just being a bit more sensitive to that. And we talked a lot about in our family-centered care training around the emotional distress is typically not picked up because we have an agenda, we try to get through things.
A lot of people just say, it wasn't your fault, but that's not what they're looking for.
Correct,
They're
correct.
looking for assistance at a deeper level.
Yeah, so the answer was it wasn't your fault, but they're looking for a little bit more validation. I'll move on to the next story here. This is really around the emotional journey. I'll see if I can get it to work.
Okay, Brenda, tell a good story, right? Because you always overshadow the bad stories. Tell a good story here. I thought, holy moly, where am I gonna, because that's not what you surround yourself with. And I thought, okay, here's a good story. And so I remember struggling so hard when McLean came home. I wanted normalcy, right? All of my friends, we'd all had our first baby at the same time. We picked up the bat phone. We all got pregnant the second time at the same time, and we all had babies the second time the same. So we were supposed to be out hanging out as as mommies and with our 2 kids, and all of a sudden I didn't have that, and I wanted normalcy so badly. McLean couldn't use anything that Chase used. He couldn't use his car seat, he couldn't use his stroller, he couldn't use his jolly jumper. And we had this OT that came in, and we're still friends to this day, and she would do home visits, and she would come in and we'd do this and position him like that. And I had this extra saucer in the corner. And for those of you that are PTs, right, you're like, no way, you're not putting him in that, right? That's a bad position. That's gonna be bad for his hips. Don't. And I used to look at that all the time, and we'd be doing stuff, and I'd look and I'd look and I'd look. And one day she came in, and she came in with all these foam things and duct tape and anti-slip materials. And she pulled over that extra saucer, and she put him in it. And she said, okay, I don't know how long we're gonna keep him in this position, so go get your camera and take your picture. So you got a picture of him in the same equipment that Chase used. And for that moment, I had normalcy. I was like, okay. And I almost forgot for a minute what we had going on. But when I told the story on the phone, I started to bawl my eyes out. And it's almost like I kept it for so long, not realizing how truly important that moment had been. But 9 years later, it still brought me to tears. And so I guess my point being is that, I believe that these personal relationships, these professional relationships they will define how this journey is going to go. And so you as clinicians have the opportunity to make this a great experience or to make this a difficult experience.
Mount Sinai became the other man. Okay, and I also said, and by the way, Mount Sinai also created the same umbilical cord that I had to deal with, and that's attached to the mom. Now here's the transfer. We come to Holland Bloorview, and most of the time she was alone. And the medical care is unbelievable. However, what's remembered is the emotional connectedness, which is the umbilical cord that wasn't separate yet. Now, what I'm hoping that we all get from this, and I like to study, is how do we learn to cut this umbilical cord? Because as the husband, I have no idea how to do it. And now all of you understand from a mom's perspective, you all don't know how to cut the umbilical cord here. So I think you need us and the perspective that we have so that we can figure out how to cut this umbilical cord nicely and together.
So quite a bit in those 2 videos. I want to focus just a second on what Stelios was saying. And does everybody understand what he's talking about when he talks about cutting the umbilical cord? No? So he's talking about the transfer from one organization to another. So in our healthcare system, when they were at the other hospital, they did a great job of supporting education and really built this amazing relationship with this family, with her wife specifically, his wife. And basically what ends up happening is that she's got this comfort level and this support system. And then when the transfer happens to here, in this example, to Holland Bloorview, they've never taught them how to cut that umbilical cord. Mom is still emotionally tied to the other hospital. So speaking to the transfer and how do you make that transfer that when the family gets here, that same support is still here. Those same relationships have already been built And so how do you cut that umbilical cord is what he's talking about, and thinking through some of that. Just in the interest of time, because I see Marilyn's over here giving me the cut. And so what we hear, again, we hear from Brenda about the relationships, and that's going to dictate how this journey is going to go for the family and how important those relationships are. There's one other clip that we're not going to show because I'm being cut. But I wanted to just make sure we captured it. And the last video really speaks about the importance of education and support, and talks about a lot around the empathy, working as a team. It really feels to our families that they are the ones that they're the case coordinators. They're talking to everybody individually, and there was a quote that was in there, which is, "When we know better, we do better." And so, what's our role in making sure that they're supported through the transition process as well as through the emotional process, and some things for us to think about are how do we make that transfer here that feels the same as the support they had for the last 3 months at the other organization. I'll leave it with that, Marilyn. I hope you have a great 25 minutes. Unfortunately, I do have to run because I'm teaching next door. So thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Amir. I hope you found these parent panel stories helpful, because it really sets the context for how it motivated, how it led, how it's informed the research that's the companion with this. So it's clinical, education, and research all rolled into one. So I feel a little envious because Amir had the kind of emotional part, and now I've got the kind of academic part, so I hope I can transition you into that well and safely. So these stories are the backdrop to why transition to Holland Blue Review, or these early healthcare transitions, are just as important as those transitions to adulthood that we're immersed in right now, and that's incredibly important. And I've had a passion for this area for some time because I had worked in that previous world, and I had the pleasure of working here as a nurse practitioner and having an incredible aha moment when I saw a family in front of me that I had actually communicated the diagnosis to 4 years previously. So I had the benefit of seeing them here as a nurse practitioner in front of me, and in that moment was humbled at how little I actually had known to prepare them for their journey. And so it really motivated me to do this research. So our research was really aimed to unearth and understand families' early experiences so that we could plan their transitions to us in a better way. There's actually 5 phases to this research. I'll tell you just about these first 2 first, and then I'll move into the next part. So in our first phase, we did a scoping review, and I would say with all honesty, I naively thought that we could just go to the literature and find all sorts of great studies on parents' experiences of transition to rehab. And after spending hours and hours with our librarian, we found absolutely 0 studies. So we knew then that we were onto an area of research that was critically important to get out into the literature. What we did find that there was research actually focused on how parents experience transition out of an acute care hospital and to another healthcare setting, so much earlier than when they come to Holland Blue Review, typically in the first year of life. So we focused on synthesizing that literature, and then we also started a study simultaneously of meeting with 18 families who had actually come to Holland Blue Review and what that full story is like. So in the scoping review, as you know, for the researchers in the audience, a scoping review is where you start when it's a new area that hasn't been pulled together before. You search everything. You search the scientific literature, you search the gray literature, you go to public documents, you try and pull together to move the science forward. And you can see we then summarized 11 papers, and I'm happy to say this was published about 3 weeks ago, so it's pretty exciting. And the scoping review told us that when families move from that first birth hospital to the community hospital, there's a tremendous fear, and you heard it repeated in these videos. They feel like they're separated from their child and they're parenting at a distance. So what does that mean to us as providers here? It means to us that if a parent is feeling they're parenting at a distance, that their attachment, their ability to parent and be the parent they hope to be has been jeopardized along the way. Feeling uninvolved and uninformed because decisions are being made around them, and in the videos they also spoke about communication and how it created this level of mistrust, especially in Brenda's video. And they noticed right away, as soon as you go from one hospital to another hospital, that we all have different cultures, and that was really troubling for parents. So that's what's in the literature. So then we started this body of work around a whole new world, and I call it that, and you heard it in the video, and the parents called it in their interviews. So what we did with our interviews was we interviewed 18 families of children diagnosed with cerebral palsy, but had also been born preterm, and had also started their life in an acute care hospital for several months. We wanted to document that this was a very challenging journey, and we did so. We interviewed 13 moms and 5 fathers, and we're proud of getting those 5 fathers because that was like doing gymnastics. And what did we find? Well, we conducted these interviews in 2015, but in fact have just finished the analysis and are just working on the manuscript now. And we found that they talked about coming to a rehab facility as a whole new world. They were introduced to new kinds of healthcare providers, new kinds of worlds like goals and plans and things they hadn't heard in the acute care environment and had heard a little bit in the community, but not so much. And they were very focused on what to expect, and they depended on us to help them paint the future for them because they had just come from an acute care world, they transitioned to home, they'd been introduced gently to the therapy world, but now the CP diagnosis and now Holland Bloor view, and it was like the floodgates had opened up again. And they talked in these interviews, all of them, about needing tremendous support, and particularly from us as well as from peers. And in the video you saw it, and in our 18 interviews we saw it. Please connect us so much earlier with peers. Please figure out what the most effective ways are to connect with peers. And parents talked, as they did in the video, about getting here physically. So those families that were of low social means, just getting here was complex, and we know that. We're all nodding and smiling. It's not an easy ability to get to for those of us who commuted on the 401 this morning. And emotionally, they all talked, and you saw it in the videos, and we cut the one clip for the sake of time, but they all talked about how they were grieving the loss of their other child, they were grieving the diagnosis, they were grieving the child who was going through all of these, and they as parents felt incredibly lost, and how important that piece is. So those were our first 2 studies, and then our third study was always one for a full scan perspective. We then did a practice scan of the province, actually, looking at what do neonatal follow-up programs and rehab centers, how do they work together? So this Ontario scan was done last fall, so only a few months ago, and we sent a survey we did actually a scan of all the websites first. What do the websites say? And do the websites on both sides of the equation of the people who are referring and talking to each other actually match? We also did a survey with clinicians, managers, leaders in both all the CTCs and the neonatal follow-up programs. And we also did follow-up interviews. So I'll just walk you through that. So first of all, the website scan, we scanned 22, and just as a background, we only focused on the neonatal follow-up programs and the children's treatment centers in the high-density population areas. So although I say it was Ontario, we picked a subset of Ontario where most of the population is and where most of these families are living and experience. So really our Toronto, Hamilton, Oshawa, Kingston board. So we looked at 22 websites, 17 for neonatal follow-up programs, and 5 children's treatment centers. And these are the children's treatment centers that connected to these programs, so we connected them. And only 4 of the 17 neonatal follow-up programs had websites, and we know that this is the first place that parents go for information. So that's a bit of a aha moment there. And when it comes to family and social support, because we heard parents talk about how much they need support, there's really nothing there. We talk a lot about how the referral process works. We might have a little bit about how the clinic works, and you can see I use the green, yellow, red light process to tell you where they lined up. So this isn't, in my mind, this isn't reflect on what we're doing badly or well. It's an opportunity to continue to work these together. In general, the websites, there was not much on emotional and informational support on websites, and one would even argue with a research hat if that's the place for it, rather than navigating to it. And in the technological age, it's really the first point of contact. So as I said earlier, given that it's a whole new world, I think it's a great opportunity, and part of our research program will look there. Our second, so this is just the sites, sorry, I should have put this slide earlier, that we surveyed with. So what did the survey say? We had 60 people answer the survey. First, we looked at formal. So what do you formally have in your policies about supporting parents? And the green is the neonatal follow-up programs, the blue is the children's treatment centers, and you can see that the children's treatment centers tend to use more formal policies. We're more mature at this. We navigate families for 15 or more years, so that kind of makes sense. What's striking to me in this slide, however, is that both in both settings, we have no formal education programs. We all incredibly informally, one-on-one with families, provide education. We do it in conversations, but we do it one-on-one, and we haven't come together as a community to say, what are the essentials of education? What's the curriculum that we want to share in our partnerships? We talked about online resources, and you can see on the neonatal side and the follow-up programs, not in the NICUs, as the dad said, as Stelio said, there's lots and lots of peer support, but as soon as they're transitioned into a neonatal follow-up program, there's nothing. And in the CTCs, we're moving forward. Now, this is informal. What do we actually do when we practice every day? So this is what 60 people said they actually do. So we all talk one-on-one with families on both sides of the sharing that transition. Again, education is not curriculumed, it's not standard. We're all kind of picking individually or organizationally what we think is the best thing. Our online resources, we've got a lot of opportunity there to work on that, and peer support as well. And what I loved about this survey, what we do as health providers and what our organizations support us to do, it matches up with what the families said in their interviews. We want more peer support, we want more resources, and we want more education. And when you see this, you go, wow, yeah, we're not really providing that. I think that might be why they're saying that to us. And it's not judgment at all. It's really just saying we haven't set up our organizations around specifically their needs. We've set them up in a great way for children's needs. We're doing, and all the parents in the interview said we provided amazing care for their children, and they deeply, deeply appreciated that, but talked about how they were desperately, as moms and dads, in need of extra support that wasn't visibly there. So our survey findings, as I said, there were 60. We had 60 healthcare professionals who responded. The greens are what we did a great job of doing. The reds are things that neonatal follow-up programs didn't tell. So the other thing that was really interesting is when we did some of the follow-up interviews, it was, I've worked with X person on the other side for 20 years, but I've actually never met them. We've actually never talked to each other, and we share and refer and email and talk all the time. So that's just a snapshot view. The follow-up interviews, I may skip through this for the sake of time so that we can get to a couple of other important pieces of this research and we have time for questions. So phase 4 of this research is a beginning partnership with OCHRS. And so I hosted a workshop at the OCHRS conference in November. with my colleagues at Niagara Children's and my colleagues at 5 counties. And what we did is we profiled the research, and we also profiled these 2 centers in particular because they have emerging different models of care where they're in partnership together. So for example, Dorothy Harvey and Niagara, they have a joint venture, very much like our solution-focused coaching here. And they have the children who are in their complex care program cared for at Niagara Children's, and the whole complex care team comes to the Children's Treatment Center where most of the services are happening, rather than having the family go to the acute care hospital for follow-up. They've integrated their services together and done a one-stop shop. As well as 5 counties, they've done the same one-stop shop, but it's in the acute care hospital because their children's treatment center couldn't accommodate it geographically. But shared clinics, shared teams, people who work on both sides of the equation was some emerging models that are happening. And we put together also in this workshop a World Cafe where we started to map out the process of transition from hospital to community. We started to record ways of improving it, specifically not for the children, but for parents, to help their readiness. And we started to select priority areas. The last thing, and we came up with like 28 priority ideas, which we took forward then to a symposium that was held here on February 27th. So this symposium was starting to build the bridge between the sectors of healthcare to meet families' needs. And you can see that the team is listed here. And we brought like-minded people together to share in this vision, to start to think about how can we improve parent education, parent resources, and peer support specifically to transform and sustain the change that parents are asking us to do. So we brought forward the parent panel, which some of the snippets you have seen. We brought forward our research, and we put lots of activities together. So our goals were to engage attendees across the span of lived experiences. So it wasn't just about families, it was about the struggles we as providers were having as well as researchers. It was partnership at its best. We wanted to bring the most up-to-date research so that those who are doing the work every day could share in determining what next. And then we spent the afternoon figuring out what do we do and what's the direction this research should take. There were 60 attendees in the building. I don't know if any of you noticed that day, but I would say 55 of the 60 people who were at this symposium had never been at Holland Bloorview before. So they were new and captive and incredibly motivated to help parents enter their new world in a new and different way. And this just geographically shows where people came from or where they logged into remotely, because we did it. We did remote broadcasting as well. And we had 2 big activities. We shared the research like I'm sharing it with you right now, but we also had an activity where we talked about what would success look like. And this was an activity really focused on what's our vision? What would we like to see for families? What are these interviews telling us? What is the parent panel telling us? What are the survey that we did of Ontario telling us? How do we pull it all together and prioritize? And we took 28 themes from the Ochres workshop, another 100 themes from the morning activities at the symposium, and brought them down to some common themes, which was the value of communication and collaboration, which we heard in the panel. Innovation and integration, so innovative clinic, innovative models of care, not the same old, that we really needed to work on empowering ourselves as well as families. And the inclusion of families in this was critical to making that next step, as well as empowering the human connection. Lastly, we then spent the last part of our symposium focused on what are the key research questions and next steps and directions. So in summary, I'll just go to, again, for the sake of time and because of our technical problems at the beginning, what's next was really our action plan for research. So the next steps are starting to build some transition bridges from these stories and families who have had early difficult healthcare experiences, how do we build transition to Holland Bloorview, and we're starting to work on some key research questions around early transition strategies, early communication strategies, early plans and sharing of early plans, and a specific program that's an integrated transfer of care. So lastly then is the acknowledgement of all the team and the funding, and in spite of technical, we have saved some time for questions. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you, Marilyn, and Amir in his absence. I think the packed room shows, I think we recognise this as a really critical issue, and I think Marilyn's doing some great leadership in research in this area. So I'd like to open to the floor for questions.
Two questions.
Sorry, quick little question. You talked about how you looked at people residing in major urban centers. Will you be looking at those families that are really on their own out in less urban?
At the symposium, for the sake of time, I cut it a little bit. At the symposium, we had a couple of representatives from the Sault Ste. Marie area trying to providing content and then talking about virtual ways of providing care and access to resources and supports that they can't possibly build. And I think, Peter, you had a question?
In the video that Stelios was talking about Mount Sinai being the other man.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it sounds a little flippant, but I think what he's speaking to is the fact that there's an incredible amount of stress on the relationship in families.
Yeah.
When they have a child who's going through this. Is there a need to try and reach out to get the other parent that isn't the primary caregiver? And is there a way that we can try and assess the impact on the couple's relationship and reinforce that in both?
That's such an excellent question. So part of as we go deeper into the video, Stelios talked about how alone he felt, how cut off he felt, and how his wife was connected with all of the activities in the NICU, continues to be a peer-to-peer supporter there, engages with that community, basically separated herself from him into that community. And he felt desperately alone. It had a huge impact on their marriage. And he threw himself into work. And in the interviews that we did with the 18 families that we interviewed in the research study, all 5 men said the same thing. They felt isolated, alone, they didn't have a way to cope, that peer-to-peer support looked different for them, and they all threw themselves into their work. One father talked about how he couldn't engage with his family until they were able, at 10 years of age, to find the way to go back to their earlier passion of skiing and bringing the family together in recreational activities. So yes, we have a lot of work to do in helping fathers communicate what their needs are and to be part of that partnership. It's a different way. It's not the way that the moms were experiencing. And that's based on 6 fathers' stories, essentially. So it's not, a fulsome research, but it's certainly very thematic. We noticed it in all interviews. Sean, yes.
When we're speaking to parents, often you see parents, typically the mothers, will not go back to work or will stay home. Do you see a comparison between like mothers or fathers that went to work and then didn't go to work and what their experiences were?
Yeah, in our research study where we did the 18 interviews, 60% of the parents were working full time. Of those that weren't working, it was moms who were at home, not dads. We haven't analyzed it that closely, so that's a great question. We'll go back and look at that because we're writing the discussion right now, and so I'll go back and look at that. Melanie.
I'm wondering about cultural factors and how those played into.
Right, so I would be the first to say that that's one of our limitations because as you can see, from the parent panel. Those are very well-educated, articulate families. And our sample for the 18 interviews as well was a typical kind of sample that you get in a Canadian study where people are generally 60% college or university educated, English speaking. So that population hasn't been addressed. In the research that I'm doing around missed appointments, we very purposely recruited families of very low income facing many, many barriers, and we've addressed that a little bit more in families who are having difficulty engaging. That's a whole different research project I'm running separate from this one. That's a great question, and we have a lot there's so much that hasn't been studied yet in the rehabilitation world. There's just so much opportunity.
One last very quick question, Carl.
So a lot of families said, sooner rather than later would have been beneficial, and so, the sooner piece would be in when they're in the ICU and they need the supports and things like that. But then when they get to rehab, I mean, how something to think about is the later piece when we do eventually move to helping these families through their grief and through all of that, how that will impact their mental health issues. Like, is there a comparison from like before where they've had nothing, now we recognize that they need something, they come to us, and then can we meet that need, and then the impacts afterwards would be something.
This might not be the answer to the question, but in writing the manuscript, I read a paper on the weekend where families 7 years after the NICU are still struggling just with the NICU experience. And the NICU world has turned their services on its head. Everything is parent-oriented now, parent-led, they've really changed, especially Mount Sinai. They've been leading it internationally on how to integrate parents into care in an amazing way. But the research still shows that up to 7 years, you're still processing that experience. Now all the other experiences, now transition, now a diagnosis, it's very cumulative. So I think it's our awareness and our starting to understand that mental health is attached to all journeys, and that we need to be incredibly wise and thoughtful about how we devise our services accordingly, so it's such a great fit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you again. Marilyn, thank you everyone for coming. In 1 minute over, forgive us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again, Marilyn.